All right, so let's add some search functionality to this page. You might have noticed that I have cleaned this page up a little bit, just tidied up some of the questions, removed a couple of questions, tidied up the tags. So that's why it's looking a little bit different, but it is ready for us to add some search filters, which would go quite nicely in this top right corner. So I'm just going to drag a box here just to hold them and call that group filters. And I'll add a little label for our first filter, which is going to be a filter that searches the questions by their title. So it's a text filter, search by title, and we'll just set the style to be a little bit more punchy. And then I'll add a simple text input. Okay, so there are a couple of different approaches to setting up search functionality. We can, of course, just modify this data source directly by adding in a new constraint, which is what we'll do first, but we can also modify this group via workflows, which we'll get to in a little bit. So I want to add a new constraint on my search for the questions, a search constraint, which is essentially acting as a filter. The key difference between doing a search constraint like this, as opposed to doing a search for questions and then doing a filtered expression, is that in this case, you're asking the database to send through all of the questions that it has, and then once you've got them, then you're going to do a filter on top of that list. So this is quite performance intensive in that first you're asking for all of the questions, not just a subset, and then you're doing this extra filtering on top. If you instead use search constraints, then in the request that you give to the database, these search constraints are embedded, if you will. So the database will only return you data that is actually fitting the constraints that you've sent it. So the constraint that we want to use is we're looking at the title, and then we're going to come down and we're going to choose one of these two. So contains and contains keywords are two different ways that you can constrain the search on text fields. And I'll explain the difference between them briefly. So let's say, for example, that we have this how did the cars get inverted in tenant expression, which we actually do have here in our database. Okay, how does the contains versus the contains keywords expressions differ in regards to how they're going to deal with this title? Well, one of the main differences is that the contains expression will return partial words, okay, while the contains keywords will not. So the partial words, for example, if we typed in inver as in inverted, then this would be returned. However, in the contains keywords, it only returns whole words. And so this would not be returned, this question would not be returned if we were looking at the contains keywords. We would actually have to type the entire word and then we would get a result. Now, the other difference that the contains clause has is that the words have to be in the exact order that they are in the question. So, for example, cars get inverted. Now that would be returned, okay, with this exact order requirement of the contains expression. But with the contains keywords, okay, any order will do. Any order will do. So we could do inverted cars get, and we would still get a result with the contains keywords. The last difference between the two is that the contains clause is case sensitive, while the contains keywords is not. So we could literally just go inverted, and this would still be returned over on this side, while it wouldn't be with the contains clause. So what we're going to do in our case is we're going to set this up with the contains keywords. It's going to give us a little bit more flexibility and accuracy. So we'll go contains keywords, and then we'll point it to that input that we created before, which I will quickly rename as our input search title. The other thing that we have to make sure that we've got ticked is ignore empty constraints. So if this isn't ticked, then anytime that this input is empty, the search constraint is going to be looking for questions whose title is empty. It's not going to consider that this input is empty and therefore we should ignore it. We have to do that explicitly by typing ignore empty constraints. And that's essentially going to say, look, anytime that this input is empty, don't actually take its value as a search constraint. Only give us its value as a search constraint if there is a real value in that text box. So let's preview this. And we'll try out our example that we had before. So inverted cars get. And sure enough, here is the result. And it doesn't matter if we screw up with the cases here. All right, so that's a really simple search by title. We also want to add in a search by tag. So I'll just drag this over by holding down Control and change this to be search by tag. And then for this filter, we will use a dropdown. Okay, dropdown search tag. And we want to make sure that we're populating this with dynamic choices. Those type of choices is going to be a tag. Since we've set these up as option sets, we don't have to do a search for, we can just access them right here as all tags, and then we will display the tags display here as the caption. Then of course we have to point this repeating group at this new dropdown. So we'll add in a new search constraint, which is going to look through the list of tags on that question and ask the database, does any of those tags contain the value of that dropdown search tag? And the fact that we've got two constraints here need not scare you. These will stack on top of one another. So this is essentially, if you can imagine that there's an AND evaluator between these rather than an OR evaluator. Both of these have to be true for there to be results here in this table, but take into account that, of course, we're ignoring any that are empty. So just to show you that in action, right, I might choose the tag tenant and I get two options here, but as soon as I use the word cars, which is only in one of those questions, then only one of those questions appears. So this is nice, but you would have noticed that there's a little bit of a delay when we are making our search by titles here. And that's unfortunately built into the way that search by keywords and contains clauses work. There is a third approach to doing searches, which is actually to use a plugin to do a so-called fuzzy search, and that will account for things like case sensitivity or typos, that kind of thing. Won't be so precise with the requirements for the search, but it'll sort of cloud the search input that you give it. And there's a really good plugin that I've used many times called the Search and Autocorrect plugin, which I encourage you to play around with if you want to use that kind of functionality in an app that you're building. One thing to note about this is that it does lead to some performance issues when you're searching through really long lists that usually get to 1,000 or over entries. There can be quite a performance lag when you're using this Search and Autocorrect plugin. Okay, so this is all working well. We're going to work around this lag that we are seeing by actually having a different user experience for this search. Namely, we want to be able to click a button or click an icon and that actually trigger the search with our filters applied, rather than this sort of live response that our repeating group is giving us right now. So what I'll do, I'll just shorten this text a little bit and drag this guy over just to give us a little bit of room on this right margin. And I'll add in an icon. And the icon that we want is going to be the filter icon. And we'll also be a little bit fancy, and we'll hide it on page load and just show it whenever any of those two inputs is actually populated. So when the input search titles value is not empty, or when the drop-down search tags value is not empty, then we want to show that filter. Okay, so that's working nicely. Now we just want to attach a workflow to clicking this icon, which is going to populate that repeating group for us in an action rather than us pulling the data source from the database. So you can think about, workflows as pushing data onto an element or a repeating group. And when you're setting the data source within it, then you're kind of pulling that data from the database. And the push side always takes precedent. We'll get to that in a second. So when this icon is clicked, then we'll come down and we'll display, and then we will recreate that do a search for. Now, rather than us literally going through and creating exactly the same search as we have already defined in the repeating group, what we can do is we can just right click on this expression and we can paste it into our action. And that will then copy across all of the derivative search constraints that are contained within this data source. And we must remember to remove the constraints that we still have in the data source. Okay, so now coming back to what I was just saying about the dynamic between push and pull, this is obviously being populated from the data source in the repeating group, which is being populated on page load. Now, if we were to push the data source onto this repeating group using our newly created filter workflow, that's going to overwrite the default data source for this repeating group. Now, we do want the ability, however, to revert back to that default data source. And for that, what we can do is we can create an extra icon here that triggers a reset of these filters. So I'll just control drag on this existing icon. I'll go for the remove icon, just this little cross, and then I'll change the color. Now I want to just pause here for a moment and talk about best practices when it comes to using styles. It can be really tempting every time that you want to make a deviation from a style to unselect the style and make all of the changes to the look and feel of an element just locally within that element itself. And that might be appropriate some of the time when there's really a totally unique element that's not going to exist anywhere else in the site and you just want to jump in and have that granular control. But 90% of the time you're making tweaks to styles, right? 90% of the style might stay the same, but you just want to, for example, center some text or change some text size or change the color of a border or something small like that. And in those cases, what I recommend that you do is actually using the conditional tab. So set a condition that you know is going to be true. The URL is not empty, okay? Some condition like that. And inside the condition there, just make the changes to the specific property that you want, centering the text, whatever it might be. And when you actually go to load the page, right, the entire style will be applied except for that one property that you change in the conditional tab. That will be the one deviation. And the advantage of doing it that way is that when you make changes to your parent styles, you know that those are going to be reflected throughout essentially all of your app because you've been consistently connecting all of your elements to styles. And the only deviations that you make are going to be locally in those conditional tabs. So last thing, of course, is just to add a condition now to this icon. And what we want to be doing when we're clicking this icon is resetting not just these two inputs, but also this repeating group here. And so, to kill two birds with one stone, what we can do is we can reset. If we go over here and we look at this reset data option, we can reset the parent group for all of these elements, which is actually this group main. So this group main is containing both the filters and this repeating group. And whenever you're resetting the data of a group, you're resetting the data of all of the children of that group as well. So this is going to be very efficient for us. We'll reset the group main, and now let's refresh the page and see that in action. So if I choose Shawshank Redemption over here, and I should actually hide this until this filter is being used, but we'll, just for the sake of simplicity, we'll set it up first like this. And then if I click this icon, then we're resetting everything at once. Right, so what I'll do to have that cross behave as it should is I could do a couple of things. I could, whenever I display the list in the repeating group questions, I also show the icon to remove. All right, and then I set this icon to be not visible on page load. All right, and then Shawshank Redemption I'm going to click that. That's going to show me my cross, okay? But then when I click that cross, it's still there, and I need a corresponding hide action over here. Now that might be okay for this relatively simple setup, but if there's more than one scenario in which we might want to show this cross, then it can get very tedious to add all of these actions every single time. So a better approach, not only for that reason, but also so we can easily keep track of what behavior is showing or hiding this cross, is actually to not use these show hide at all, but to use custom states. And we're going to be talking a bit more about custom states in the next video, but just as a quick reference, a custom state is just a container for some value, right? The container can have a certain data type, like a text or a number or a question, it doesn't really matter. And those custom states live inside of your elements. So you can use the value stored in one of those custom states as reference data, for example, for your conditional statements. So the custom state that we're going to use is just going to be called search active, and it's going to be a yes or no field. Okay, and this is just going to track whether or not this repeating group is behaving according to some search filters. So by default, when the page is loaded, it's going to be no. But whenever we actually change this filter, we actually want to set that state, set the custom state of our group filters to be yes. And when the reset filter is clicked, then we can set that state to be no. And you might be thinking, well, that's just as many actions as we had before. And yes, in this really simple setup, that's true. But if we had more than one element that was behaving according to whether or not there was an active search or not, we're going to save ourselves a heap of time by just having two actions to set the custom state and then setting the conditional behavior of all of those related elements directly in the conditional tab. So now we can simply have a condition that says when the group filters search active is yes, and if I don't click anything here, this is exactly the same as if I type is yes, then we'll show that element. Okay, so I might go cars. I'm going to do this step by step just to show you. Display list in the repeating group, and then set the state search active. And then this guy over here, if I inspect him, we can see that this condition is evaluating to yes, and so the element is visible. And now we could do, an unlimited number of things. Maybe when the group filters search active is true, then on this group filters, we want to give it a border. Okay, now that's something that we couldn't do via the workflows. Or maybe we want to add some text down here that says, search active. Of course, this is a pretty ugly UI, but now that we have that custom state set up, we don't have to have a custom action that is going to literally show us that text that we just created, right? And then a corresponding one to hide it. All we do is we just look in the conditional tab to define the behavior. When group filters search active, then we'll show that element. All right, so that's a little bit on custom states. We'll talk about them a bit more in the next video. So in the next video, we're going to be adding a tabbing system just like you see here.